Hi, my name is Eyal, and my favorite thing is chasing the runner's laugh.
Welcome to the Finding Favorites podcast, where we explore your favorite things without using an algorithm. Here's your host, Leah Jones.
Hello and welcome to Finding Favorites. I'm your host, Leah Jones, and it is the weekend of the big game. The Super Bowl for the NFL is happening this afternoon, and I'm now 3 years out from having worked in consumer marketing and have found that what I've learned in the last 3 years is that Super Bowl commercials are not actually a hobby of mine. So the Super Bowl catches me off guard now in a way that it didn't when I worked in consumer PR and marketing. Maybe you've got big plans, you're doing smaller versions of the snacks you make every year. Without parties to go to, we have to make more dishes. If you want like a full spread of Super Bowl snacks, I'm going to make some of my HelloFresh boxes. I'm behind on cooking, so I want to get those cooked up so I have some good leftovers going into the week. And then I will watch on Twitter, as I do every year, for the commercials that are good, and then I'll go find them on YouTube. This weekend was a hard one for my family. It was my Uncle Jimmy passed away 2 weeks ago. Yesterday was his funeral, and we are a go-to-the-funeral family, but COVID combined with the Arctic weather meant that it wasn't the safe choice for us to attend the funeral in person. My parents and some cousins who lived closer to the funeral home went for a private visitation with my cousin Tracy and her boys, but my sister and I stayed home, so we didn't take our city germs to the funeral. So we watched on Facebook Live. Credit where credit is due. The French's Funeral Home in Brazil, Indiana, does a really good job of making sure that the sound from the room gets to the live stream. They have a good camera angle. So I want to give them credit for that. I also really appreciate that their pastor read the eulogy as I wrote it. But I thought what I would do with my intro today is read the eulogy in my own voice so that I can share it with my family and share the memory of my Uncle Jimmy with more people. And I also he was a member of his volunteer fire department for 57 years. And when somebody leaves service, it was really remarkable. First when they took him from his home where he died to the funeral home, they brought all the trucks out to stand at attention as he drove by. And then he was escorted by the fire department from the funeral home to his grave yesterday. And then they called his final service on the radio. They kind of retired his number in his uniform. He was buried in his firefighter uniform. Just remarkable, the honor paid by this organization that he gave his life to. And I said it on Twitter, but I'll say it here. Many years ago, I was doing a national promotion with Pizza Hut. We were doing, it was called the Flavor Tour to support their new menu. And we went to towns called Boring, Normal, and Bland on our flavor tour. And when we were looking for local charities to work with in Boring, Maryland, we worked with their local volunteer fire department, in large part because I knew how much a $10,000 donation from a brand would mean and how much a local volunteer fire department could do with that kind of donation. And in Bland, Missouri, we worked with their baseball field because my sister has been a league commissioner in her local baseball and softball organization, their park league. So again, I knew there that the money could do some good. I want to share with you so here is the clip of the fire department saying goodbye to my Uncle Jimmy, Jim Proctor.
506, Putnam County. Proctor, Putnam County, is out of service. Your final duty will be to watch over your family and fellow firefighters. Jim Proctor, Unit 506, has gone home and is out of service for the final time. Dispatch is cleared February 6th, 2021.
So thank you for listening to that. And here I just want to share the eulogy that I wrote for my Uncle Jimmy in my own voice instead of in Pastor Steve's voice. When I was little, my great aunt Gertrude would torture me by calling me Jimmy. She was always perched at the end of Grandma and Grandpa's kitchen island when we walked in and would announce that Jimmy had arrived when I came into the house. I thought it was because I had the same large nose. By the way, our noses are actually fine. Or maybe because I got tan like he did in the summer. I never asked, and I don't think any of the adults knew either. It was just this weird thing that happened anytime I walked in the door. But as a grown-up, I realized that if you had to be mistaken for someone in our family, it is Uncle Jimmy. Uncle Jimmy was an outstanding storyteller. Sure, the stories rambled, and you might have heard it before, but eventually you were going to hear the gift of Uncle Jimmy laughing while he tried to get to the next sentence out and wheezing in a laughing fit by the end. Uncle Jimmy showed up for everything, and if there were 2 family events on the same day across the state, he would go to the event that gave him a road trip, and Aunt Barb would go to the closer one. He drove cross-country with our cousin Bob to go to Liz and Pete's wedding in Seattle. And when my sister and I graduated high school on the same day across the state, he and Dad went to my sister's and Aunt Barb came to mine. Uncle Jimmy never stopped experiencing new things. When this total solar eclipse happened a few years ago, he called my dad and they went on a road trip to southern Indiana, or maybe even Kentucky, to see the total eclipse. They pushed the minivan as close to empty as they could, coming back on country roads to avoid heavy traffic. And they had 0.03 of a gallon left. They ran out of gas as they pulled into a gas station. He had a tremendous commitment to his community. 57 years at the volunteer fire department, 50 years at the water authority. I knew he had something to do with the water tower in Reelsville, but only learned after he died that he walked door to door collecting memberships to bring water as a public utility to Reelsville, Indiana. In the same article, I came across this quote from him. What I always say about everything I've done is, you know when you're standing in a line and someone asks for volunteers to step forward, everyone else steps back, and there I am, still standing there. Right now, I'm president of my synagogue in Chicago, and as my term wraps up, I wrestle with my plans as a leader and a volunteer. What does it take to dedicate 57 years of your life to volunteering to the same organization? God willing, I have another 50 years to dedicate to my community, and I hope beyond hope that Great Aunt Gertrude was right, and that this is something I might have in common with Uncle Jimmy. Tracy, he loved you and the boys, and I know that he and Aunt Barb will continue to protect you and guide you. May his memory be a blessing. So again, thank you to Pastor Steve, who read my eulogy on my behalf yesterday, and to the French Funeral Home for doing such a good job of the live stream. And thank you to the listeners for learning a little bit more about Uncle Jimmy Proctor. His wife, my Aunt Barb, her funeral was exactly 3 years and 1 day before his. I didn't realize that it was the same day until Facebook memory served me up some photographs this morning. And so with that, this week I talked to my friend Eyal Halamish. He is currently in New York. You'll hear he's got a kind of Australian, Israeli, American accent because he spent the last 15 years living in Australia. And we had a really fun time catching up. We met on a group trip to Poland in the summer of 2019 and really hadn't had a long chat since then. And so we're catching up. We talk about Torah, we talk about running, we talk about composting, all the normal things. So without any further ado, here is a conversation between me and Eyal. And as we move forward with more vaccines, it's still so important to wear your mask, wash your hands, stay home if you can, and stay safe. Hello and welcome to Finding Favorites. I'm your host, Leah Jones, and this is the podcast where we get recommendations from people and we find out about their favorite things without using an algorithm. Look, here's the deal. I'm thrilled by my guest every week, but this week I am super excited. My friend Eyal Halamish fucked it up.
You nailed it. I thought you nailed
I said
it.
it okay?
Yeah.
My friend Eyal Halamish is here with me this week. We have not seen each other since we were leaving Warsaw, Poland. We met, like a couple of my other guests. We are friends through the International Jewish Community, through ROI Community. And we met in Poland in 2019. And now Eyal is host of the podcast, The Future City, which explores the future of cities and technology and arts and culture. And he's based in New York, but he works for a state government in Australia doing tech and economic stuff. So he is the friend of mine who has lived in the most places and is the hardest to pin down professionally. And we only talk to each other when it's Parsha Yitro. Eyal, how are you doing today?
I'm great. I'm glad we're back on Parsha Yitro again.
As an explanation to people who are not in our private text chain, many years ago, like 11 years ago, there was an animated weekly Torah commentary at the time called Godcast. Now it's called Bim Bam, that my friend Sarah Lefton, who's also in this ROI community with us, that she started. And I gave the commentary for Parshat Yitro, which is happening this week. And a year ago, Eyal texted me. He was like, I was just getting caught up ready for some Torah study, and I watched a video and realized it was you. We were texting this week, and I was like, hey, do you want to come on my podcast? And then I scrolled up, and I was like, oh, and also the last time we talked was exactly a year ago on the Hebrew calendar.
It's really crazy that you bring that up, because funny enough, what inspired me to start reading the weekly Parsha, which is, every week the Jewish people read the next bit of the Bible, basically the Torah, right? And so as we read this on a weekly basis, it kind of happens. And for a lot of, for a good chunk of Jews who are like very culturally Jewish, but not religiously Jewish, this stuff just kind of passes by, and we claim Judaism, but don't really do anything about it. Unlike you made a freaking weekly video about this thing, you went all in.
I made one video.
Right.
I'm not the weekly person on Godcast. I am the Yitro person.
Right, you're the intro. Okay, so the craziest thing is that when at the same trip that I met you in Poland, I met someone else named Nico, who was an Italian Jew who was on the trip with us, right? Who you also know very well.
Yep.
And he was on the daily going and praying, and I was like, oh, he must be quite religious. And he said, no, I've just a while ago I decided I was going to start reading the weekly, Parasha, the weekly Torah or Bible portion, and because I just wanted to be more connected to my faith. And I was like, oh, that seems like a really simple way to do this.
Yeah.
So that was literally around a year ago. I started doing that, inspired by him. And that was when I contacted you. That was because I was like, oh, I wonder what this is. So a year ago, I started doing this thing, and now it's a year later, and it's been pretty cool, actually. And
nice.
Today we actually had, of all things, a Clubhouse gathering. I've never done this before. Jumped on this new app called Clubhouse, where people just kind of tune into conversations in different rooms. Either way, we had a Torah portion discussion about Yitro, for which I rewatched your video and all the things.
And I saw, so Clubhouse, for those of us who use Android phones, I keep getting told by my friends as they join, they're like, Leah, you are the person in my contact list that has the most friends on Clubhouse. Why aren't you on it? And I'm like, because I use an Android phone. So it's like group audio chats, and then there's some people talk. It's like a fishbowl, right? Some people talk and everybody listens, or what is happening?
It's very fishbowly. I am the last person to ask about this. Today was my first time really being on Clubhouse. So I'm like, I'm just a tech guy who knows nothing about this specific technology that we're talking about.
Right.
But it felt very much like a fishbowl. You had a few people speaking, and they could actively invite other people into the fishbowl at different times to speak while the audience is listening. So the equivalent of what you probably would experience if you were to go to a conference, for example, or an event, and someone's on stage speaking and everyone's listening to that, and then they call someone from the audience to stand up on stage and start speaking as well, and so you can have this interactivity. It did flow quite well, and it did take a little bit of facilitation and moderation, which was
Right.
quite well. Luckily, we also had some things that people knew. A lot of people knew that some people were told, hey, there's this thing called Yitro. It's a part of the Torah, of the Bible.
Right.
Have a read, and like come ready to discuss how you're feeling about it or whatever. And people, some had read it, some hadn't. It was like a day at school where we had to call on people, and some people had done their homework and some people hadn't, but it flowed really well.
And then because it's audio only, you can't tell who's averting your gaze and is like, I did not read the Torah this week. Don't call on me.
Exactly. Yeah, it was very much pulling together the scraps of paper in front of them to try to say something meaningful. But no, people came from a really, there was it was framed in a way where people could chime in and kind of speak about anything they really wanted to, was top of mind, or what they're grateful for right now, or just if they had some wise words that they'd learned and a reflection about the Torah, or what we were speaking about then. So it was cool.
It's have heard a couple of my rabbis have said essentially the Torah is always right on time. And part of why we read it every year is because what we bring, it's not that the Torah changes every year, it's that what we bring to the Torah changes every year. And so this year when you're coming back to Yitro, and I focus on I will link to the video, but in my telling of it, I really focus on Yitro teaching Moses how to delegate and the importance, if you're a leader, the importance of delegation. And a year ago, we knew a little bit about COVID. We were right. Like we probably knew more because we have more of international friends. So like if your bubble is like an international bubble, we knew people like in Italy, like Nico, or people abroad who were starting to get locked down because of COVID.
Totally.
But talking about delegation and judges and judging a year ago, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was alive, before COVID,
totally,
versus today, like we're bringing something different to the Torah every year, and that's why we keep reading it every year.
It's so true, and it's fascinating. Even interestingly, that's what I focused on, is the fact that we've got this story, and if you've all seen Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments, where we're kind of mid that story, right? So Charlton Heston's up on the mountain, he's acting as Moses, and he's hanging out with his father-in-law, which is Yitro, which is Jethro, right?
Yeah.
And his father-in-law basically says to him, hey, Moses, you're like taking questions from all the Jewish people and telling them what God says and doesn't say about whatever they're asking about. Like, this is a big task. You're not going to be able to do this on your own. And you're right. Like, Moses becomes this really good leader who listens to his father-in-law, which is kind of rare for a lot of people to listen to their father-in-laws, and also is willing to kind of deliberate on what his father-in-law says, and then say, yeah, we should delegate. Let's build a system, a framework where we delegate to like judges and priests and other people to make decisions about this stuff based on them having a direct line to God, or the influence of God, right? And I think, and I actually focused on the exact same thing. I was saying, I'm a guy who like loves democracy. I love democracy. I love this delegation thing. I built a tech company that was specifically focused on democratizing stuff. And even so the fact that we've got this parashah where basically his father-in-law is like, hey, democratize like the word of God for the Jewish people. Cool. Like, let's do, and honestly, I think this little moment where, a father-in-law says to this guy, like, you should democratize this. That's the reason the thing still exists today, because we've built a really robust democracy. And if we take it to the point of, you just said, a year ago, we had a very different president, right, who wasn't delegating very much and wasn't really open to working through the system. He just like had I've got the word, and the word is what I say, and that's everything, right? And then now we've got a president who's very much like deliberating and taking it on, and working through the democratic system. And so I think it's just like, it's, as you said, we're adding more meaning to that. Very different meaning than we were a year ago.
Very different. Yeah. And you are so where in the world are you today?
Yeah, great question. I am currently in New York City.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Because when we met, you were in the process of moving from Australia to New York. And you're from the Chicago area, which I always
Yeah.
forget. And then I was like looking at your Facebook and I'm like, right, he's from here. When people ask you where you're from now, what do you say? Would you say like Chicago, or would you say Australia, or like how do you answer where you from?
Oh my gosh, it's so confusing. I mean, I feel nowadays more and more people have this problem where they're just like, I don't know anymore. I've been in too many places.
Yeah.
And the main thing is that I have been basically like I grew up in Chicago. I lived in Australia for almost 15 years, from the ages of 21 to 35.
Yeah.
And I basically, I acquired a new citizenship in the process and did a bunch of things there. And then I recently moved back via Tel Aviv to New York, right? So I'm in all these different places, and I think it's to some degree I feel a little bit more Australian at the moment, just because that's where I've last been, and I'm still kind of re-assimilating to the American way. So as of right now, I'm kind of an Australian American with Israeli roots. So I don't know
Yeah.
where I'm from, but I'm a citizen of the world, as a few of us are becoming,
Yeah. Do you regret coming back now? Do you wish you had stayed, like knowing what we know now, do you wish you had stayed in Australia like one more year?
It's There's definitely moments during what's happened in the last year where I was like, wow, it would be awesome to be on a beach in Australia right now and not in the middle of a really intense city like New York. I've loved it. Like, I think a lot of people in New York feel like real kind of survivors and thrivers. Like we've kind of, and I'm sure a lot of people in major cities in America feel that as well. And I'm sure around the world as well. It's like, hey, like we sat through this pandemic in like a really intense place,
Yeah.
and we went down there and we wore the masks, or and we did all the things. And so a part of me, like, yeah, it was like, oh, it'd be fun to escape. And a part of me is kind of enjoying the resistance, the intensity of it all.
Yeah.
And there is like a magic that everyone knows when they come into New York City of like, oh wow, there's just like, even though the city is completely empty right now, and it's not what it normally is, there's still some kind of magic. People walk to New York City and they have these visions of like, oh, this is kind of a cinematic experience. I've seen this in a movie somewhere. I've seen this. And as I walk to New York City, I've got that, except now it's a cinematic, like apocalyptic movie, or like
Right.
an end of the world type scenario. We're like, oh, this is what New York City looks like when it's completely empty. Crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, I miss, because I usually go to New York like twice a year, and I had, in the last time we were texting, I was like, I'll be there on April 4th. I was going for a 40th birthday party. I was so excited to get back to New York, and it's definitely high on my list of when I feel like safe traveling again is one of the cities I want to get back to. But I miss it. I miss everything
Yeah.
about New York except the just the garbage on the streets. Chicago has alleys, we have dumpsters, and I can't forgive Manhattan for not having a better place to put its trash than the street corner. But other than that, I
Yeah.
really love New York.
Totally. We do have a waste management problem. It's actually, I was mentioning to you, like, this podcast is about favorite things,
Yeah,
and I was like, what? That's such a hard. It's like a tough thing to figure out what you love, especially when you love so many things.
right.
But waste management is actually something I really love.
Yeah.
And specifically, I love composting. Okay, I really love composting, and I love it because it's just, I feel like it reconnects me to wherever this thing came from. I'm like contributing, but also what was weird when I came to New York City, I'm like, oh, I can't compost here. Except in my first week or two, my sister took me down around the corner to a place where they collect all our compost scraps in the city. So
Oh,
you can actually drop your scraps off that you store at home, and you
yeah.
you take them down to, like, in a couple of places they collect them right by the train station, which is awesome and used to be quite relevant when you were taking the trains. But
Right.
nowadays they collect them at the local markets, and I'm like, I just like love this thing. I think it should, I think they need to scale it up. I want it coming to my house and picking it up and the likes. And I am a little sad that I don't have it, but that is the waste part is something that I love about,
Yeah.
it's an element that I love for sure.
There's a Chicago has at least one, if not two, subscription compost services where
Right.
they it's like the milkman, and they come and you have like a specific place on your property or near your property where you chain up your 5-gallon bucket on pickup day. So there are days when I walk around my neighborhood and there's just like little green 5-gallon buckets, like bike chained on to a light post or a fence. And so they'll come by, they'll get your bucket, they'll swap it out for a clean one. And so like subscription where they take away your composting, and then if you need it back because you're going to garden or something, they'll bring it back to you. Not yours
Yeah.
specifically, obviously, it's not bespoke.
I mean,
So,
it's kind of it's just a funny concept, even waste, like having, dead fruit and peels and things like just hanging out in the middle of the street, right? And
yeah.
also just and I do think it's just an interesting yeah, like you even here in New York City, like you walk around and there's people standing with multiple buckets and there's people are walking to their apartment just dropping it into this bin, and then it kind of goes away somewhere as well. And I think like you said, in Chicago, it's hidden away in alleys. In New York, it's hidden front and center, but we just
Right.
ignore it. But waste is something that we constantly just forget about,
Yeah. Right. And before I press record, we were also talking about how it can be really difficult to pick the favorite thing to talk about. And I've had friends who have been upset with me for months because they forget that I asked them to be on the podcast and they couldn't pick a thing, or they're worried that the thing they didn't pick will get envious of the thing they do pick.
I mean, this is the thing when you zoom in on your favorite things, you start to get buyer's remorse about picking the wrong favorite thing. It's like I like composting. That's happening to me right now. And as I'm going through my day, I'm thinking about all the favorite things. And now here we are, I'm sitting with you. I'm like, oh my God, what's my favorite thing? I got so many favorite things.
What are some of the things on your in your funnel of favorite things, as we narrow it down to the one thing we're going to talk about? Like, what is battling for your love and attention for the next hour?
The funnel of favorites. A lot of times we'd like to talk about the favorite things from our work, like you were saying, I love talking to people, even in a podcast about, the future of cities. I love talking about like thinking about that thing that's bigger than ourselves. And it's kind of esoteric, it's spatial, it's like, it's hard to grasp it sometimes. And you really want to find an expert who's really into flying machines or like really into waste disposal or like really into the thing, but I do like it when you find someone who's able to take our mind from kind of the day to day to this bigger picture of what's happening in a city, But then I really do love composting. I also really love candles. I love candles.
Nice.
I have this like addiction where every time I go to the shop, doesn't matter what I'm buying, I'm like, oh, they've got candles. They've always got candles. But I buy one like every time.
I've been doing more scented candles since COVID started as my affordable daily COVID test. Like, can I smell the scented candle? Okay, don't have COVID. So I have one going behind me that I can't reach because then I'm attached to the microphone. But it's called the Magic Candle Company, and it is Disney scents. And so I have Walter's Office, which is like a tobacco and leather, very masculine candle. I got Flying Over Orange Groves at this beautiful citrus one. That's what I have burning right now. And then the Castaway Cruise, which is like the smell of a Caribbean cruise.
It's candles are a funny thing because you have these scents that people have invented. I love this, like the Disney scent, right? Yeah. Because like, what is that? It's totally a visual experience. You're imagining what it might smell like, right?
Yeah.
But now, thanks to these guys, you can actually smell, Beauty and the Beast. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, how far I can stretch my like the variation on the scents that I buy, because normally I stick to a couple of like classic smells. I think I like my something a bit more woody, a bit more maybe a little bit flowery, but like then you start to get into I don't know, fairy floss and like fairy floss is an Australian term.
It's cotton candy.
Cotton candy. I just like slip every once in a while, a little word clicks in.
Right.
But you have these scents that are just getting a little bit out there where sometimes you actually don't even know what they're talking about, like unicorn tears, like what is that?
Right.
I have no idea. I don't even know that scent is totally fake.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay, so there's composting, there's candles, there's you're a runner. I know you're a runner.
Yeah, I was gonna say that actually was one that came up. Running, I thought, I ran this morning. That was the thing. I like running a lot. I like kind of things that are a little bit extreme, where they like push your body to the limit a bit.
Yeah.
Um, I like tea. They just I like being in a heated location when it's freezing outside,
Yeah.
and I like fake meat. Love fake meat. I just love
Okay.
that people have the creativity about, hey, we're gonna try to recreate that exactly as it is, just from
Yeah.
different ingredients. And you're like, that's so weird because
It's so
people
weird.
gave that up, but now they gave it up, but they kind of want it back,
Yeah.
just with a different source.
I have to say the Impossible Whopper, if you haven't had it yet, is delicious.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it bleeds. It's interesting. I
It
didn't realize that
bleeds.
it bleeds. The Impossible Company actually did a bunch of research to figure out what's the way we can make the burger bleed. And there's
Mm-hmm.
this thing called like soy hemoglobin, which is
Okay.
they've kind of engineered,
Soy
which they
blood.
put into soy blood, which they've put into their burgers so that when you cut through it or when you cook it, it bleeds so you can have the full experience. But it's kind of made up. They had to get
Trying to
it FDA
fix my
approved.
face.
Yeah. This is how far we go. It kind of
This
reminds
is
me.
this is to get people. So I have the friends who have become vegetarians or they're eating less meat for environmental concerns, but there's a lot of people who became vegetarians because they were against the cruelty of animals. So then to choose to replicate blood when you're if you're making the choice out of one to get away from cruelty seems bananas to me. But maybe the bleeding impossible meat is for people who like love meat and are having a hard time giving it up versus people who are like worried about animal cruelty.
And I think that's it. Like I think you're spot on. For me, I actually am a vegetarian, so I just like it because it's creative. For
Yeah.
me, when people are making bloody meat that isn't meat, it's like when you were a kid and your mother would take you to buy some candy or something or like a cake, and you had like a burger that was actually a cake, but it was in the shape of a burger and it was just
Yeah.
cute.
Yeah.
Or like they had engineered a bunch of sugary stuff to look like something that it's not. You're like, oh, that's so cool. They created
Yeah.
they made that incredibly real looking cheeseburger out of Oreos and like other sweet things, right? And so Impossible Burger's kind of done the same thing, right? Except it's real food. And
Right.
but I don't think that they're targeting the vegetarians so much. They really do want the meat people to be thinking, oh, this burger is just as good, if not better, than the one we get from the farm, the
Right.
other farm.
Yeah, if
And
you
so,
can get
yeah, they want
someone
it to bleed.
who's hitting drive-throughs regularly to like swap out a Whopper for an Impossible Whopper and like make that, if you can get someone to go to Meatless Mondays and
Exactly.
that's like the only change they make, it's you're inching towards progress.
Exactly. And I mean, I think it's just so funny how we're so addicted to the blood. Is that they were like, oh, this is clutch, we got to make it bleed, you
Right.
know?
That's wild to me. Huh. Cool.
So yeah, these are a few of my favorite things.
So that's a great introduction to the variety of things you like, but what are we going to talk about today?
Which of my favorites is your favorite?
I would say like it's probably like composting and running are the things that I am aware of and know the least about, so I can have a lot of questions for you.
I just love watching you kind of rack through it. You're like, what's gonna there, bam, it's like a fly was running through you, like swatted it. And I was like, that's
Yeah,
it, boom, go
that's
for
it.
it. Sweet. Yeah, I love those things. So let's talk about them.
We're going to start with running because it is not something I do. I ride bike. I ride my bike as transportation, and I am someone, for me, it does get too cold to ride a bike. I did in my 30s. I did have a winter where I proved it to nobody but me that I could ride in like 20 below weather and in a foot of snow, and I did that in 6 layers of clothes. And after that point, I was like, I don't have to prove to anyone that I can be a winter cyclist. But what I'm not is I'm not a runner. I'm a mosier. I'm a walker.
Yeah.
So how did you not come out of running? Did you like run in high school? Were you when did you start running as something other than running from the person who is it?
Well, it's funny. I wasn't a runner in high school, actually. I used to make fun of the runners. I was like a little bit of a high school bully on the running front. I just thought, oh, if this person if this person's running, like, why are they running? What's the
Mm-hmm.
point? I actually remember I played soccer and I was on
Yeah.
the soccer team. Whenever the runners would run past us, I would always shout, "Nobody runs for fun." Like, that's
Right.
crazy. And fast forward to in my 20s, I was in Australia. A buddy of mine just said, "Hey," and I think this is like, this guy clearly built this business as like a gateway drug to running, because there's a thing called Tough Mudder, where it's like a
Yeah.
adventure
Obstacle
run,
course, right?
obstacle course. This Navy SEAL has basically, an ex-Navy SEAL equivalent has basically decided he's going to design the same course that you do for these, extreme military units. We're going to design it so that the average person can, train up and do the thing. And I did the course with a couple of friends. And the thing I realized in going, like, we had to run through fire and like jump, swim through water and through mud and all these different obstacles. The thing that I ended up realizing was that we actually ran a long distance there, and that was kind of fun. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, maybe I am gonna run a bit further. So I set a goal. I was like, you know what? I ran that distance. I'm gonna run a half marathon, because that seems like a long distance that I've never run, and I'm just gonna try it. And then I started doing that, and then a culture builds around it. You start running, and then you got friends who are like, oh, I'll run with you. And then you're like, oh, now
Mm-hmm.
I've got friends through running. And then you've got peer accountability, all these things. And at first I was running to kind of look cool out there. I was like, oh, I've achieved this thing. I can just tick that off. Right.
Right.
And then it started becoming, there's the community around it, the whole bit. And I also started noticing that my body had weird little things happen. So one of them was this thing called this runner's laugh. And I remember this. I was training like crazy for a marathon,
Yeah.
and I think I was running multiple times throughout the day. And the one night I was out with some friends, and I just started giggling like crazy, just uncontrollably giggling, and I couldn't stop it. And I was actually kind of scared that I was laughing, and
Was
scared that
it
I couldn't
during a
stop this
run, or
thing.
like you were just like having a drink and you started running, or you started laughing, or was it
Had
running or like hanging out?
I was hanging out. I was just hanging out for dinner, and I just started uncontrollably laughing. And I was like, "What is going on?" And I thought I had taken some kind of drug. Like, I was
Right.
like, "Am I on something?" But I hadn't. It was Tuesday night. I had done nothing. I was like, "Have I been drugged?" And I'm asking them, and they're like, "No, you're just laughing like crazy." And I actually had to excuse myself, and I went home. And I'm at home in my, laughing uncontrollably. Ended up laughing myself to sleep, and actually was quite nervous that I would wake up the next morning and not be able to go to work. So I was like, maybe this is gonna have it.
Because
And I ended up
was it almost, it was like as compulsive as the hiccups where you're just like, well, they're just going. You just had the
correct.
goals and no control over them.
There was correct. It was just completely uncontrollable, hiccup-esque laughing, right? And I couldn't stop it. I'm drinking water. I'm trying everything. I keep laughing, and I ended up laughing myself to sleep. Wake up the next morning, and everything was fine. And I was thinking, what was that? And I researched it, and there's this thing called the runner's laugh,
I've
or
never heard of it.
yeah. And
Never.
so if you get your body to a certain point, you start to have sometimes what's called a runner's high, which is you start to get high from the experience.
Yeah.
But it could sometimes get to a point where you have this uncontrollable laughing. And I have, since that moment, I've been chasing that high again. Like, I want that to happen to me again, because it's never happened to me again, right? I've read up about it. It's not a big thing. It does happen. People have written about this happening to them. Like,
Right.
yeah, I've had this uncontrollable laughter as a result of running so much. And so now I'm just running to get back there one day. I just want to do it again.
I mean,
And
My
Leah,
mind
and
is
you're,
blown.
and you're, for you, this is big because like you've had to work really hard to make people laugh.
Right.
Imagine if people had to work really hard to like run for like months on end in order to make themselves laugh. Like that's a feat.
It really is. So was that a point? Was that your first marathon that you were training for? Was it the first time you were training really hard for something, or was it down the line you'd done a couple and you were trying to like you were going towards a personal record breaking run?
I had run a few at that point. I was like, oh, I'd done like a marathon or two, and I was just, now it had become part of my life. I'm also a bit of a, I look for these, intense physical experiences. So I was really into yoga for a period of time, and I was like, okay, now I'm really into running, and I just do it for a period of time. So I think I was a couple of marathons in, and it was just training for another one because that's what, the
That
cult
was your
of
hobby?
humans around me. Yeah, that was the hobby. And so this just kicked in. And I actually went and, I was quite taken aback that this could happen and excited by it. I was like, whoa, this could be a thing. We could be chasing the giggles, running
Yeah.
instead of away from it. I could be running towards the giggles.
Right. And it's never happened again.
And it hasn't happened again to date. Yeah.
A run, do you get that euphoria from running? Do you get a high?
Yeah, totally. I mean, when I've run, and I'm sure other runners out there have had this, where you run for a certain period of time and then your body just kind of kicks into autopilot,
Sure.
and then you also start to get the endorphins kicking, and then you get that high, and
Yeah.
it really is, I mean, it's awesome. It's the same high you get when you're laughing or when you're, just, yeah, it's a really good high. I love it. I really do still love it. I actually went for a run this morning. I've got a West Village, New York running crew that every Saturday morning they run 10 kilometers, which I'm trying to remember what that is in miles, but they run 10
So
kilometers.
bizarrely, running distances in the US other than marathons, people always refer to it in the metric set. Like people are always like it's a 3K, 5K, 10K for whatever reason. So a 10K doesn't even blip. And like I know a 5K is like 3.2 miles or it's
Yeah.
2.3. It's
Yeah,
in
yeah. I
there.
think it's 3 points. I think you're right. It's like 3.2. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
It's it's an interesting point because a lot of these runners, we've got some internet, we've got a lot of Americans and people, it's actually a group of Australians and a group of Americans running together. And so we're constantly between the numbers of like miles and kilometers. And
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm like, what? We should just pick one and stick to it, but
Right. Marathons, whenever people talk about marathons, like when you were in Australia and you were doing marathons there, did they talk about them as 26.2 miles or did they talk about them as kilometers?
totally kilometers, 42 Ks,
Okay.
42.2 kilometers. Yeah. I
Okay.
actually didn't know what a marathon was until I came, how long it was in miles. I forgot. I was like, what is it? 26.2 miles. That seems so short, but it's
Right.
really long.
Yeah. The races that my friends do are either 5K, 10K, half marathon, or full marathon. And then
Yeah.
occasionally I know
And
someone who's like an ultra, like the 100-mile overnight stuff. So has running been consistent for you since Tough Mudder, or is it something also that comes and goes?
running's been fairly consistent. I evolved out of running into triathlons for a little bit.
Okay.
And I do feel in Australia, doing triathlons is like kind of like surfing for them. They, everyone you've met as a kid, they learned how to surf, and they've like done a triathlon in school at some point. That was a normal thing to do. I don't think
Right.
it was as normal in Chicago because we didn't have bodies of water that people were regularly swimming in, and it
Yeah.
just wasn't a thing, right? Well, running, a friend of mine called me one day. He's like, "Hey, we should do this triathlon," and I really didn't even know what it was at first. I was like, "Oh, I think that's bike, cycle." That's cycling, swimming, and running, right? And he's like,
Right.
yeah, well, I've got the running down pat. I ride a bike to work most days. So I've just got to like figure out the swimming bit. And I actually had to teach myself to swim. I remember the first triathlon I ever did. I'd like signed up for it on the Friday, not really knowing exactly what I'd signed up for, thinking, oh, my marathon training should tie me through. called my buddy the next day, and he asked me 1,000 questions that I had not the right, he's like, "Have you got the right bike?" I said, "Yeah, this one." He's like, "That's not the right bike." He's
Right.
like, "Have you got the right, do you have the right swimming gear?" I said, "I got this." He's like, "That's not the right swim." Everything was wrong. I had to go and buy all these things. And then the next day I'm at the race. And at the very beginning, when you do a triathlon, you swim, then you cycle, then you run. And it's
Okay.
important to go in that order, because if you swam at the end, you'd be so tired you might drown, right? So they want to get you
Sure.
through the swimming first, and then the cycling, and then the running. And so at the very
Sort of
beginning,
stepping down the danger.
yeah, exactly. You're like, hey, if you stop, you just stop running. And
Yeah.
then if you stop cycling, you might fall off your bike. And then if you stop swimming, you die.
Yeah.
I was standing at the beginning of this triathlon, realizing we're all about, all these 30 to 34-year-old men who are dressed like SEALs, basically, in their black full,
Right.
bodysuit with swim caps and the likes, all with their gadgets that are going to track how fast they swim, run, and cycle. We're about to jump into this body of water and swim for like a good distance, 750 meters, almost a kilometer, which is,
Yeah.
far. And so, and as I'm standing there, I realized I've never swam in the ocean, period. Like, I've, I've never done this before.
Right.
And this is the first bit. The other two I have done, the cycling and the running, but I've never actually swam in the ocean. I've swam in pools, and I've kind of flopped around in the water of an ocean, but I haven't fully done like a swim. I was like, crap. And then I'm looking at all the people next to me thinking, whoa, these people clearly know what they're doing. I'm in my, my like my
Board
Speedo
shorts
here.
and
Yeah, like my just, trying to figure it all out. I don't have half the gear. I don't look half as fit as the people who are about to jump in this water. And they blow the whistle and we get in the water, and everyone's clamoring over each other. And I'm trying to just keep my head above water, because, when you've got 40 dudes all entering the water trying to swim as fast as they can, they're like kicking each other, hitting each other, not
So are
intentionally,
you
but yeah.
running in from the beach or jumping from a pier? Like, are you going out to a buoy and back? Like, how do you swim a kilometer in open water that's not a lake? I understand
Yeah.
open water lake swimming, but I don't totally understand open water ocean swimming.
Yeah. So you're running off, you're on a beach where everyone's set up on the beach, and you're running, a couple of, maybe a couple meters into the water, and then you swim out to a buoy, and you swim to another buoy, and swim to another buoy, and then swim back. So you're kind of doing a loop out
Okay.
there, right? And then when you come back in, you got to get onto your bike. And so when we enter this water, all of us are like running in, and then we're clamoring each other, and everyone's trying to start kicking and pushing and shoving, whatever. And I'm, one, having not swam in this, two, having never swam with 40 other men clamoring at the same time, and three, the water is really murky and kind of, there's splashing everywhere, so it's very hard to figure out if it's deep enough, like, where am I, it's just
Right.
very uncomfortable. And so I just figured, I'm just going to let them all go ahead,
Yeah.
and then I'm going to gradually enter the water. It's my first time, right? And
Yeah.
so I gradually enter. They're all swimming very well ahead of me, and I'm swimming, initially trying to swim freestyle, and realizing I'm not very good at freestyle, so I just start breaststroking.
Right.
And then the next leg of people get called in the water. They all pass me. Basically, every leg after leg gets called, and they all pass me. And I'm swimming very slow. And at
Yeah.
one point, one of the lifeguards paddles over on a surfboard and just says, "Hey, mate, you got to be out in 45 minutes. You gonna make it?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'll be fine." And I'm just paddling along at my slow
Oh
pace through the
no.
water. And then at one point, a second lifeguard comes, and at one point, I had a flying V behind me of
Uh-huh.
lifeguards basically chaperone me around the buoys as I slowly swim around this track. And eventually, when I get to the end of the swim, literally all 5 lifeguards are clapping that I've gotten out of the water. They're like grateful that I've finished. And
Right.
when I got out, I ran towards the bike rack where the bikes are, and there's the one security guard there who's monitoring the multiple hundreds of bikes, and he points to my bike, which is the only bike that's left because everyone's clearly passed.
Brutal.
And I was like, "Oh, that's mine. Of course, that's mine." So I run and get on my bike, and then my goal was to try to make some ground, but I think I barely made it halfway to, the original group I entered the water with. But that was
Yeah.
my first ever triathlon, and then I started getting into, hey, what if I actually trained and tried to learn how to swim better and do all these things? And
Right.
now it's more part and parcel, right?
So now if you ran into the ocean, you could swim freestyle out to a buoy.
Exactly. I've
Okay.
gone from not able to do that to now able to do that. So tick.
Yeah. Amazing. Um and that was you, like, literally you signed up on a Friday and did the race on Sunday?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So very spontaneous and
it was definitely, yeah. I mean, I remember calling my buddy saying, "Hey, man, there's it's like when you're filling in a form and you don't know what the form means." I was just like,
Mm-hmm.
"Hey, are we doing the sprint or the Olympic distance? Which one are we?" And he said, "Oh, I think it's Olympic. I don't know, man." And I realized the Olympic is the longest one that we signed up for. So we did our
Oh,
first triathlon
no,
in
you
a
definitely
long.
should have done the sprint.
Yeah, I definitely should have
Right.
done the sprint. Yeah. Now in retrospect, I'm like, what were we thinking?
And did that friend was he like a better open water swimmer or?
He was, because he was born and raised in Australia, not the sunny shores of Chicago. So
Sure, fair.
he was like born in the water versus I was born I was swimming in Evanston Township pool when I
Right.
first started swimming, and
Right.
just hated every minute of that chlorine smelling place.
Yeah. When's the last time you did like is a marathon the longest run you've ever done, or have you done anything?
Anything longer than a marathon is considered an ultra, even if it's like 1 kilometer more. Like if you run just
That's
a couple,
sneaky.
if you
Right.
run a few meters more, a few feet more, it's like, oh, now it's an ultra because you've technically run a longer distance than a marathon.
Yeah.
So there is one marathon that's on the Great Ocean Road, which is basically, there's a road that kind of goes from Melbourne, which is the southern tip of Australia. It's like in the ass crack of Australia, basically the butt crack of Australia, and it goes all the way west towards Adelaide, which is on the other, along the road. And so this Great Ocean Road follows the it's a beautiful, road that cuts across the southern part of Australia. And they do a marathon there every year. It's called the Great Ocean Road Marathon. They tried to do it from town to town, but because the towns are just a little bit further apart from each other than the marathon distance, so you kind
Yeah.
of run the marathon and then you have to run a couple kilometers more to get beyond there. So instead of a 42.2 kilometer marathon, it ends up being about 45. So
Okay.
that's the longest run I've done from a race perspective.
Right.
The last one, I'd signed up for the New York City Marathon, but it got canceled this year. So I was
Yeah.
gonna, do I do it virtually? I almost did it virtually this year, but I ended up, saying maybe I'll wait till it's got the whole hoorah rah around it.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems hard and I've got friends who are hardcore runners. Like my friend Amy, for her 30th birthday a couple years ago, she ran 30 miles, and she and her boyfriend, or now her fiance, organized a 30-mile run around Chicago. And different of her running friends, I was not invited to this part of her 30th birthday. I was invited to dinner. Um, People
The
were
better
like,
part.
I'll run this 5-mile stretch with you. So she had people running, like doing a relay. She ran the whole 30 miles, and people did like a relay for company with her around the track, which was really
I mean,
cool.
that is cool. I think if you're going to do one of these virtual marathons right now, like, if you're going to sign up for the New York City virtual or the Boston virtual or anywhere,
Yeah.
like, yeah, lay out the track and then invite your friends to do what your friend did, and I was saying that when I was in New York, saying, hey, if I run this, will you do the first 5K, next 5K, these 10K? You break it down and it becomes a social. Because when you're marathon running, it's a lot. I mean, it's a very hard, long task.
Yeah.
It was called the marathon because a guy died
At
running,
the end. Yeah.
at the end.
Right. The
So
finish line is where he died. Yeah.
exactly, crazy that we honor that over and over again, by running till the point that someone died. Thanks to modern health and modern medicine and a whole bunch of other things, we're now able
Yeah.
to run for that distance and not die for the most part. There is this point, at least I've experienced it, where at the 30-kilometer mark, so the last 10 kilometers, right, maybe the last kind of hour of the run,
Mm-hmm.
up until that last hour, like you could, if you train enough, you can run for 3 hours, right?
Yeah.
I know that sounds crazy, but like if you do the training, you put in the time, you'll start to build up this ability in your body and even in your mind to kind of make it through, of just like, hey, I could jog for 3 hours and that would be
Yeah.
okay. But once you get beyond 3 hours, something really weird happens. Like you just your whole body goes into, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Like, are you crazy? And you're like, wait, no, we're almost there. Like, it's just, you've run 3 quarters. We got 1 quarter to go. Come on, we got this. And your body's just like, oh no. And your brain's like, oh no. And it starts going in all these different directions where your mind starts starting to convince yourself that you can't do this anymore and you're out of here, and your body starts hurting and you start noticing it in ways you hadn't noticed it before. And it's that last 10 kilometers that most marathon runners are thinking, how am I going to make it through this crunch? And that's
Yeah.
when you've just got to like train your brain. And the fun is actually not the physical, it's the mental kind of hunker down,
Yeah.
come up with the mantra or the joke or the thing that's going to keep you going for a long period of time, for at least an hour, through whatever pain and weird thoughts you got going on right now, to make sure that you don't stop until you cross the finish line.
Yeah. I do understand that you can train yourself to get there because I've done the Susan G. Komen, the 60-mile walk twice, 2 years in a row, where it's like, it's supposed to be like 3 20-mile days.
Whoa.
Yeah, as I was training to get to there, and it was like, well, for this training walk, it's 3 miles. Okay, that's from my house down, right? Like it's very easy to track distance in Chicago. And then I was like, okay, well, I've got to do like a 14-mile training walk. So I guess I'll walk to the loop and back when I lived in Edgewater. I'll just get on the
Amazing.
bike path and I will walk all the way downtown and then I'll turn around and come all the way back. But when you're doing that kind of charity walk, and then I trained in Chicago and did the walk in Atlanta and was not prepared for hills. And I really did not. I got in the van in Atlanta and had them take me right to the campground.
You were like, save me.
Save me, yeah.
I think it's, I mean, that's the other cool bit is you start to look at your city in a different way. You're like,
Yeah.
oh, I normally drive that or I bike that. Like if I could actually walk that now, like, oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
And your city starts to become actually a little bit smaller in a good way. It becomes kind of accessible in this way where you're like, oh, I could just run there. Interesting. I never thought of that, or I could walk there. And and I might actually see the city in a different way. A lot of my running these days, in fact, in this year, my new running goals are to actually see, it's not ideal, but it was actually to see new cities. It's actually to use the running to see cities. I normally, when I land in a new city, one of the first things I do is go for a run just to learn the streets and just understand the neighborhood in which I'm in. And also when you sign up for marathons, the cool thing and the reason why I wanted to do the New York City Marathon was to experience all the boroughs of New York City through a run, or I wanted to do the London one to get all the different pockets of London in a run. And you actually do experience a city quite differently. I mean, of course, when it's shut down for you to run through it, it's pretty different.
Absolutely, right.
But it's also, you experience it quite differently because you're looking at it from a different perspective of not just, should we stop in here and have a snack or should we go here and have a drink? But like, oh, isn't that interesting how different this neighborhood was from the last one that we just ran through, or how the people here are, more connected because their houses are much closer together or further apart, whatever the differences might be. So I think it's kind of a cool way to experience our little world.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love seeing a city or finding the slow streets and finding, because like Chicago, when I got to know Chicago by bus and by train, when I moved here, the major grid streets. And then when you first start riding your bike, you're following the bus routes that because that's how you know how to get around the city. And then you start learning about the secret one-way streets that have like amazing trees and they're quiet. And yeah, walking, running, biking is such a great way to get to know a city. How has COVID impacted running in New York? What do you run with a mask on? Is that weird or hard, or like how do you run with people during COVID?
It's a great question. So initially I was going solo, and at the very beginning there was tons of paranoia by me and people I was with about the fact that I was still going on runs.
Yeah.
And at the beginning it was like zigzagging through the city. I was like, oh, human, 6 feet this way, human 6 feet that way, and then I was running with a mask, but I heard, stories about people running with masks and like hyperventilating from having their mask on, and these, just maybe it's not the safest thing to be running with a mask. And so I was kind of doing a bit of both, where I would like put it on when I would pass someone, I would take it down when I would go, the like. And I still do a little bit of that nowadays. And I think there's still, I guess with all this stuff, you have to take on kind of a certain level of risk of like, okay, I'm going to do a thing.
You learn what your like personal risk tolerance is.
Yeah. And we all have it. There's a point where there's some people who are still not going to grocery stores, right? And there's some people who are like, okay, I'll go to the grocery store, but I'll wear a hazmat suit. that makes hazmat is American English, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
can
yeah.
never. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
That's a word that makes sense.
It's like, have I gone Australian again? I'll go to the supermarket, I'll wear a hazmat suit, and people are choosing how they want to do these things. And even with the running, you see that as well. There's people who are like, oh, I don't run with other people, or if we do run, we need to maintain a certain level of distance. And I was running alone, but recently found a group of these Aussies that are running in New York City, right near in my neighborhood. And they all have they've created these little pods where we run it with our pods. We keep certain levels of distance from each other.
Yeah.
And we're updating each other if there's any issues, any cases, or anything coming up. And it's got a level of risk, and it also doesn't. But we put the mask on when we pass the one, we keep it off, for the most part. And at some point near the end of the run, you've kind of lost consciousness of what's going on. So you just you either have your mask stuck on because you forgot it's there, or you have your mask off because you're now sweating your guts out and you actually don't remember what's going on around you. So
yeah, I've ridden my bike outside a few times, and it was hard to, because I'm on a street. I live on Damon, and it's a major. There's a store a couple blocks south of me that a lot of bike racing teams start their training rides at.
right.
So they go. I see guys like kitted out fully in latex going north on Damon, and they're headed up to Wilmette, to Kenilworth, like they're going up to the Botanic Gardens and coming back. And I have wondered, that's not the type of riding I do, but like, how do you manage that? I don't know.
Thing.
It's something I think about when I'm sitting on my couch, drinking my coffee and watching them. Let's be honest, ride home, because I'm not awake when they're leaving.
Yeah. We call those guys mammals, middle-aged men in lycra. And
yeah.
I was actually thinking, the mask, the annoying thing about wearing a mask when you run is that you sweat on your mask, and then you've got to wash the mask, and then you need like a running mask, which is the one that you sweat in, and then you need the one that you normally wear out. So I've now got like sweaty masks and non-sweaty masks. And also, but living in like Chicago or New York, or if you're in a cold city, masked running is great, because normally you'd have this hit of like, there's these hats that are kind of like masks, where they kind of cover you and they just have eye holes and like mouth holes. And it used to be really untrendy to wear these things. They're kind of like a little bit scary.
Yeah.
But now you're thinking, this is great. I got my face covered. I look like a total weirdo, but it's all working for me. And we're kind of recreating that a bit with the mask as well. Is that, you got your face covered, so it creates heat for your face while you're running in sub-zero weather. And so I kind of like it. I like actually having the masked runners experience nowadays, because it actually helps me warm up to my run, or actually feel like, oh, it's not going to be that bad, because the wind chill's not going to be up against my face the whole time. Right. It'll just wear off with the mask first.
Yeah, that's true. The one thing I found that's a sensation I don't like is that when the mask gets sweaty, and I went to something at the Botanic Gardens, so we're wearing our masks, we're going through, and then they had like hot chocolate in the middle and tables, distant tables. So we stopped, we got hot chocolate. You take your mask off, you drink your hot chocolate, then you go to put your sweaty, cold mask back on. And that's not a great feeling. I don't love a cold, sweaty mask. So I do now have like, there's just masks in every pocket of my purse. Like if I go digging in my purse, I'll find a few masks, and just to deal with it.
And do you label them? Is you're like cold sweaty mask? This is like the picnic mask. This is.
They definitely have different styles. There's a downstate. There's a company that does baseball jerseys and axe throwing jerseys.
Whoa.
They make a really nice mask out of like athletic material. So I have those that I really like. I got some from Hello Tokyo that are highly structured, with like the, like sewn around the chin, and like they fit a little bit better. And then I've got some K95s, and I've got some blue surgical. I just have
mix and match.
I need to go around. They're like, missing socks. I do have because I live in a pretty big 2-bedroom. I do have masks they're not organized right now, but I'm not leaving my house very often, but I kind of have masks all over the house in weird places, and I should collect them. The mask organizing is not great at the moment.
Because it's a thing we're not used to having in our lives. It's like, oh, oh, it's still in my pocket. Oh, I guess I'll leave it here. And
Right.
then you find it on the toilet. You're like, oh, that was awkward.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting on the mask. I also was when this thing kicked off, everyone was discovering whether their mask was going to be a liability or like a fashion statement. I met a friend who and I've kind of shared a little about my eco warrior bent,
Yeah.
and from the composting through to other things. And a friend of mine, I saw her mask. I said, "Well, that's a really cool mask." She's like, "Yeah, it's made from recycled plastic." I'm like, "Oh, where? Send me a link." And so I go and buy these things online, from a place called Rothy's, and I was like, "Oh, cool. Rothy's must be
Oh, the
this like
shoe
cool."
place. Yeah.
Exact. So I didn't know this. So I thought Rothy's must be this hip, cool, like plastic granola renewable, brand. And I buy the mask and I'm wearing them around, and someone's like, "Oh, that's from Rothy's, like the luxury shoe brand." And I'm like, "Is it?" And they're like, "Yeah, that's like a women's luxury shoe brand." And I was like, I have no, like, why would you buy that? I was like, "Oh, because it's made from recycled plastic." And then I
Right.
was walking, and there's one here by my place. You can't buy the mask. You can only buy the masks online, and
Yeah.
and by the way, they are amazing masks. They're like
Oh,
thick.
that's good to know.
They're fit to your face. They're really really well designed. Two for $25. Just I actually really like the mask. So I've actually bought a few now as a result. And today on the morning run, I was wearing one of my Rothy's masks, and one of the women on the run said, "Oh, that's a Rothy's mask? Do you shop there?" And I was like, "No, I mean, technically I do,
Right.
but I've never been to the store."
Yeah, my brother has gotten really big on the Tom Bin masks. Like the Tom Bin is it's a luggage company.
Right.
But they're making so they've got like now 4 versions of the mask out. And so something else something you asked recently on, I don't know, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, who knows? Because you do have this podcast called The Future City, where you're exploring the future of like urban life, how we live. And you had asked, how did you think COVID was going to impact housing?
Hmm.
And I think we're going to get like if I owned this apartment where I live now, I would have installed a little sink by my front door. Like I wish I wish on our first floor foyer, I wish we had like a little hand washing station, like
Yeah.
hot water, actual plumbing, that as all of our neighbors came into the house, we could like stop and wash our hands. And so I think I don't think it's a return of, I don't think it's ever been, but I do think like the foyer hand washing station, that's a
Yeah.
trend I think could happen.
It's interesting. I did ask that question about like what does the future of home look like as a result of COVID, and I think a lot of people did write about these kind of external kind of add-ons that we're probably going to have on the home, and one of them is around. I think station. Actually, no one mentioned the outdoor water cleaning station, but people did talk about having, and it's weird. It's like they basically said a mailbox, just a bigger one that has a lock on it, so that someone could drop packages off and like use the lock to drop something big, so that
Right.
it doesn't have to exchange as many hands. And you could just be like, "Oh yeah, just put it in my lockbox outside, or put it in my cage outside my house, and
Yeah.
and that'll be it. I'll get to it when I get home or whatever." Right. But yeah, it's I think you're right. Our buildings might change a bit, at least for a period of time, if not forever. And I think the
Yeah.
water stations is great. Like, why not reduce the amount of flu that we have moving around as a
Yeah.
result of people washing their hands, right?
I think that would be nice.
That was also, it's an interesting thing of we've extended our home to like bigger than our home, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, now that park is my home too, or like
Yeah.
that dugout's gonna be like that's my front porch now, right?
Yep.
And I think I think it's pretty cool. Like, like your friends are coming around and be like, "Should we go to the lounge?" It's like, yeah, it's around the corner,
Yeah.
in the dugout.
Yeah. So, Eyal, as we get close to wrapping up, I've mentioned your podcast a couple times. Is there anything that you would like to promote? How can people find the podcast? Should they follow you online? How do they make sure that they're buying technology from Australia? I don't know. How can people follow you, keep up with you online?
Yeah, amazing. If you want to check out the Future City podcast, go to thefuturecity.org and it takes you to all our amazing episodes. It's just really fun. You know, you could tune into everything from people designing flying machines for cities through to one of the world's best bartenders talking about how to bring the weird into cuisine and cocktails, and up to like ministers and government people talking about policies and all the important things about how we structure our cities. And so if you go to thefuturecity.org, you'll hear me and my buddy Luca ramming on about that. You can follow us also on LinkedIn and Facebook. And yeah, I'd love to see you guys there.
Fantastic. Well, this has been such a delight to catch up. And I regret that it's been so long since we had a nice long conversation.
Me too. It's been so much fun. And let's do it again before the next Utro.
Yes, we will.
Thank you for listening to Finding Favorites with Leah Jones. Please make sure to subscribe and drop us a 5-star review on iTunes. Now, go out and enjoy your favorite things.